Good.
Yeah. I love you.
I love you too.
All right. I'll talk to you in a bit, okay? I'll let you know when we're done.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 3 o'clock straight up, and I'm really glad that we are ready to start another HU Talk. And before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you haven't heard it enough, we are in the middle of homecoming week. And so we have some great in-person events coming up at the end of the week. So I want to remind people that the homecoming parade is at 9 o'clock on Saturday. And following that, we welcome you to join us at the tailgate over in the Champ Tyrone Music Building parking lot. And then, of course, you need to make your way into the football game, which starts at high noon on Saturday. So those are just a few of the events, and there are many more that you will continue to be hearing about. I wanted to remind people to remain muted while you are attending today's talk, and you can unmute when it's time to ask questions, and we encourage questions. That's always fun. And I do want to give a special shout out to our sign language interpreters. We're really happy to have Gabby and Caitlin with us today, along with their professor, Carol Litherland. And so happy that they have been able to make these talks accessible. So let's see, with that, I wanted to introduce our speakers. So the next talk is going to be called BRATS, a different kind of veteran, and that's BRATS, capital B-R-A-T-S. And Roxanne Gonzales is the provost and vice president for academic affairs at NMHU and is in her 8th year here. Wow, time has flown by. Seems like you just got here. A native New Mexican, she left the South Valley in Albuquerque when she was in kindergarten when her father got his commission in the Air Force after his graduation from UNM. She has 2 sisters and 1 brother, and they're all proud brats. And another brat that we want to talk about is Alexis Duran, who's been with NMHU for over 24 years. Wow. And is currently the senior administrative assistant for the Office of Academic Affairs. Alexis was born in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, where her father was stationed in the Army. She spent 16 years traveling with her family in the military, and she has 1 biological sister and several military siblings. She is a proud Army brat. So with that, I'd like to welcome our 2 speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everybody. I am going to share our screen. So let's hope that this works. There we go. Can everybody see the cover? Let me see if I can get rid of this stuff here. All set?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Alexis and I were having a conversation a few weeks ago, and I don't know how we stumbled upon this, but we discovered that we were both brats. And like many people in different areas, when you meet someone who has a similar background, you just sort of make this connection and off you go. And so we've been sharing stories about growing up in the military. And so we decided that maybe this would be kind of a fun and different type of presentation to do HU talks. And so Alexis, would you like to say anything before we get going?
Yeah, I'm excited about this. We've been talking for the past couple of weeks going over this, and I think it's probably important that some people know about the military brats, because there are tons of us that people don't realize that have a great connection.
Okay, so I am going to try to see if we can move this forward. So what is a brat? When we hear brat, sometimes we think, oh, that's a kid who's probably not a very good child. Maybe they're just disobedient, but brat has a very specific term. And typically those are children, when you're in a military setting, those are kids who grew up in military families, whether the parent was in for 4 years or a full career, 30 years. It's been interesting. I belong to a couple of face group brat sites, one of which is Air Force, and there's always a discussion about where does the term come from. So we did a little bit of dialogue or research, and nobody really knows where it originated, but there's some ideas here. I'm not going to read them to you, but essentially most of what I read really brings it down to this British regiment attached traveler, somebody who was attached to the military member as a child and followed their parent around. What I did find interesting is that in 1707, there was a song about a recruiting officer, and the song describes brats and wives, and they're assuming that brats in this context probably means kind of a little bunch of kids running around wild. But there are references in and out of history about what a brat actually is. But I think for most of us who grew up in the military, brat is something that we actually are very proud of and very happy to be. So Alexis, do you want to talk a little bit about traits of brats?
Can you unmute Alexis?
Sorry about that. Our traits of our brats, most of us, we are very respectful people. We tend to be a lot like our parents, because if you're in the military, there's normally a lot of respect showing there. We're very adaptive with life, just because we grow up with so many different kind of cultures, so many different kind of people. We're very disciplined as well. We did grow up in families that we did chores. We very much had to help with the family, because 9 out of 10 times one of our family members wasn't there because they were out in the field or they were on mission. We all have these similarities. Brats today, it's a struggle. A lot of them have parents, have one, but maybe both of them might be out on mission or might be overseas in war at this point. So you never know, but we all have a lot of the same similarities.
I think one of the things Alexis and I talked about this morning, her bratness was overseas and mine was pretty much in this country, but my children were raised as brats. Sometimes they are brats, but the one thing about kids when they live overseas is they really pick up this multilingual aspect. My kids came back speaking German and one of them came back fairly okay in French. And so when you have children, and this is not just with brats, these are people who maybe, one of our friends was a daughter of a foreign dignitary. So when you have children who live overseas, they often pick up those aspects of what it means to be in a multicultural, multi-language environment. The other piece is that in the military, obviously all cultures have bias, but the military doesn't really tolerate it very much. And so I think when you grow up in a military environment, you are raised with a concept that we don't bring our biases to the table and we will adapt to wherever we're at. And I think that's one trait that brats do have. They are very adaptive. You can put them just about anywhere. Most of them adapt. There are obviously students who or kids who don't. We created a list of famous brats. We tried not to put politicians in here. And we tried not to put people who were 500 years old, like me. But we just lost a real famous one, Chris Christopherson. He was also in the Army, I believe, Alexis?
Yes.
I
do believe he flew I do believe he flew helicopters.
Right, I think so. So he grew up in the military and then he went into the military. There's a couple of interesting names on here that surprised me. Bruce Willis, I had no clue. Jim Morrison, for those of you who are around my age group will remember, I think he was with the Doors, kind of a rebel. But there's a lot of folks here. John Denver is probably one of the more popular ones. Mark Hamill was, what's that character from Star Wars? Skywalker, Luke Skywalker. Any names on here, Alexis, that you thought were interesting or you didn't know about?
Actually, I knew a bunch of these. I did not know Bruce Willis was a military brat. That kind of threw me off, and I didn't know Reese Witherspoon was a military brat as either. I was aware that Christina Aguilera was a brat.
Now, there was quite a few interesting names. There's a lot of athletes that were on that list, but I didn't know. I don't really follow a lot of athletic stuff, so I kind of left them out because I didn't know if they were really old athletes or athletes that we have today. So what we want to do is we both put a collage of pictures together for you. And so we're going to take a little time kind of going through that with you to sort of take you back in time to when we were kids. And I'm older than Alexis, so you're going to get some, I wish we had somebody who was a really brand new brat. But Alexis, talk to us about your great collage here.
Okay, we did a collage. This is kind of my life in a nutshell. As you can see, we lived in many different places. We traveled to many different places. So we were in Italy for vacation one time. We lived in Germany, my family as a whole, for 8 years. We lived probably like in, I don't know, about 7 different locations. These are the different bases that we were at. We lived in Germany. My dad worked at Coffee Barracks. He was at Fort Gordon. We were in Texas in Fort Hood. We were in Fort Bragg. We were in different places. The pictures on here of me and my family. The picture of me, my dad, and my sister was the day he came back from the Middle East. There's other pictures of just the family all together in different locations. There's a picture here with me and my family. We were at the World's Fair here in the United States. It was in Louisiana. On the bottom there's a picture of my military family that we grew up with. So it's just a mix of everything. My dad was airborne. He used to jump out of airplanes for a living. And it's my life in a nutshell.
Little different than a lot of folks when they grow up.
I'll check with Roxanne.
So that's the Army perspective. Let me share a little bit of an Air Force perspective. So you'll see here in the middle, it was kind of fun that we both chose to put our parents' symbol in the middle, airborne. I grew up in the Air Force, but I grew up in a very unique Air Force. I grew up in an environment with the Strategic Air Command. The Air Force is broken up into commands, but I grew up in Strategic Air Command, more commonly referred to as SAC. It was started by Curtis LeMay as a strategy to combat and make sure that we were not going to be in any kind of a situation with the Russians. This was really in response to nuclear, to prevent nuclear war or to keep nuclear war at bay. And so what you have here are a lot of pictures of the bases we were at, my father's airplanes, the really pretty silver one down there, the F-86. The big bomber is the B-52, and that airplane is expected to be in the inventory, I guess, until it's 200 years old. They keep refinishing it and revising it. But it's sort of the airplane that keeps on giving. And at the bottom left there is an FB-111. But I think what you see here is if you look around, so this is my kindergarten, first grade in Ohio, in Texas. There's pictures of my one sister and my brother in Ohio, California, my mom and I, California. And this is the only picture I have that with me of the whole sibling family. That's my youngest sister, Michelle, my middle sister, Melissa, my brother, Don, myself, and my husband. I hate to almost show you this picture because this was the 70s. We were pretty cool. He was wearing striped red and blue bell bottoms with a hip hugger white belt. But you'll see this term, mission first. I grew up in an environment where when things would go and we would do things, it was mission first. That was the crux of our family. Whatever we did, it was around the mission. And we didn't do a lot of traveling. When we were vacationing and stuff, we would typically go to Albuquerque. This is where we came to spend all of our holidays, and our vacations was back here in New Mexico. So growing up in an environment where your language is mission first, the logo for Strategic Air Command is "Peace is our profession." But put that in the context of the Cold War. That's what SAC was established for. It's no longer SAC. But marches in California, McCord is up in Washington, D.C., or Washington State, sorry. Carswell's in Texas outside of Fort Worth, Bright Pat's in Ohio. And we really didn't travel a lot, but we did quite a bit. So I have a question for you, Alexis. Where are you from?
Where am I from? That is a very difficult question. And it's very difficult for all military brats because we don't have one location that we can say we're from. My general response to that is I was born in Missouri, but I was raised everywhere else because I'm a military brat. That's my standard answer for that. You're going to probably get a little bit similar from everybody else, but in general, that's a kind of a standard for all of us.
And I answer in a very similar way. I say I was born in New Mexico, but I grew up in the military. And people who kind of have a sense of what that means, they kind of go, okay, I'm done. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear all the places you've been. But I love this little picture of the little girl. She's kind of like, oh my gosh, you really don't want to know. But this is a real challenge for military brats. People don't understand that maybe you've lived in a lot of places. You went to 10 or 8 schools, 15 schools. If you're born overseas, you have more than one birth certificate. You have 3, sometimes 4, depending on what country you were born in. When you come back from overseas, Alexis, I'm sure when you came back, did you have any kind of reverse culture shock coming back to this country?
It was very difficult coming back to the United States. We had been in Germany 4 years, and to come back to the world of the U.S. was really difficult. It was really changed from when we left. I was in we were in the military DOD school in Germany, and we came back and we were in a civilian school. So to change the way they do education is really different because DODS is so far ahead compared to the American civilian schools. It was a big change for us.
You know, and what I'll say is even just moving from, let's say, Ohio, when my father got an assignment from Dayton, Ohio, imagine being told you're going to move to Southern California where they have beaches and you're going into, 6th grade, and whoa, moving to California, what a difference between moving from Ohio to California. Totally different cultures. So it's not just a culture shock from country to country, it's even moving across the country. I think the challenge we all have is defining home. Where is home? You know, and we were talking about this. This has been a great opportunity. Alexis and I have been sharing stories. We shared this morning. So where do I consider home? Wherever my family is. I've lived in over 51 different houses in my life, including my husband's career and my career. 51 places. So a house is a house. Alexis, how do you define home?
Same way, a house is a house, home is where our family's at. Home is where you lay your hat, because houses don't mean nothing to us because we had so many of them. It's always, where's our family at, and that's where home is at.
You know, we both talked a little bit about spending time with family back here in our family of origin, if you will. That's one of the things I remember growing up. I have a lot of cousins, first cousins. Both of my grandparents are in the South Valley. And when we would come to visit at Christmas or in the summer, my cousins that were there all knew my aunts and uncles really well. They knew each other really well. And sometimes we'd come and I'd feel like an outsider to my own family because I didn't grow up with these people. How about you?
Same, we got to see our family every 2 to 4 years if we were lucky. So we were outsiders in our family. It was special occasions when we came to visit and the family normally got together. So we were the special occasion, but we didn't get to see them. But every 2 to 4 years, very seldom did family come to see us. So it was difficult.
You just brought up a point that we didn't talk about, but when you're living overseas, you know, I watched that TV show, HD Home Hunters or House Hunters. And when they're overseas, oh, we're going to get an extra 2 bedrooms because everybody's going to come visit us. And my husband and I go, no, people don't do that. How about you?
No, we only had my grandparents, and they brought 2 of my cousins. That was the only family that came to visit us. And it was literally the last year we were in Germany.
It's expensive for people to travel overseas. So there's that disconnect as well. And there's challenges living overseas. Well, we still have so much more to talk about. When it's expensive to live overseas. When we lived overseas, when I was first married, we didn't have a phone because we couldn't afford it. Rationing of gas and things like that occurs overseas. So it's a different lifestyle altogether for families. So why don't we talk a little bit about a real gated community? Alexis, you want to start us off?
Let's start this off. So when you're living on base, everything is in that little world on base. Everything you can imagine, they try to make it available to us on base, whether from security, housing. There's so many different housings because everybody's different on base. You have your enlisted housing, you have your officer housing, but we're all living on housing, sharing all the same accommodations that are available. As a kid, we used to love the youth centers and the bowling alleys. We spent a lot of time there. The movie theaters in Germany, we would get the movies late compared to you guys in the US, but yet we got all the VHS movies like 3 months before they were released here in the US. That was a bonus. But, you know, but living on base, it's our own little world. You really don't have to always leave base to go find what you're looking for because most everything is there.
So one of the things we talked about is it is its own environment. You don't have to, I was sharing that when we were in England, I met a woman who'd been there 4 years and never left the base. She didn't have to. Everything she needed was there. But there are things that kids can get involved in. I mean, the youth center had all kinds of different activities for the kids to keep them essentially out of trouble. I don't know about you, Alexis, but my father used to say, if you get in trouble, then I'm going to get in trouble.
That's
So
right.
stay out of trouble. I don't want to get called to the commander's office because you got in trouble. So the youth center was supposed to help take those wayward kids and keep us straight. But you could even work on base as a high schooler. I worked at the base exchange, which is kind of like a Walmart, if you will. I started working at 17, and as I got married into the military, I took that job with me, and I worked for him for 8 years wherever we were transferred. The commissary is like a grocery store. So it's got all your food supplies and everything. And A lot of kids would leave school at the end of the day and they'd go to the commissary and bag groceries for tips. You could work at the youth center, you could work at the bowling alley. And you'll see there's a veterinarian on here, and they weren't just there for people's pets. They were there to make sure that the food supplies at the commissary were good, that the food courts were okay, that the clubs were okay. You see something here, morale, welfare, and recreation. You could go rent kayaks. You could go rent, just like we do with our outdoor rec here at Highlands. You could do that, but on a much bigger scale at an MWR facility. You could rent, those things, trailers to go camping. And a lot of them now even have holiday resorts that you could go to. We stayed at Garmisch in one where it's run by MWR. Hawaii has a couple of hotels through MWR. So it really is, it's an insular type of environment. The libraries are up to date and modern. Clubs, by clubs, we mean places where you go eat dinner, they have dances, you could have functions there. It was pretty cool, but you had to go through this section here where you have to show your ID and get on base first. That's the catch. You can't just go in. So one of the things we wanted to do was talk about, from a kid's perspective, what we remembered globally of happening, how we perceived it as a kid. Alexis?
So me growing up, my first overseas tour was in Panama. And during that time period was when they did the treaty to hand the Panama Canal back over to the Panamanian government. It wasn't fully handed over till 1999, but during that time was when they signed the treaty. The other big event that we were in Germany during that time was the fall of the Berlin Wall. It happened in 1989, and we were there in Germany. We weren't in Berlin, but we were in Germany at that time, and we were able to, as a field trip, I was telling Roxanne, with the school, they took us to where the Berlin Wall, where they were taking it down. And I have a piece of the Berlin somewhere in a box, but we have a piece of the Berlin Wall. And then, of course, the Gulf War, my father actually was in the Gulf War, and he was overseas for almost a year in the Gulf War. So we got to see a lot of world events when growing up in the military.
And it's a different perspective being the kid of things that are happening. So we both have the Cold War as something we both experienced. And in the middle of the day, you see a desk. And I remember very clearly, because we were always close to one of our bases in the schools, having to do air raid shelters and nuclear bomb shelter things where you ducked under your desk just like you did for tornadoes and earthquakes. I don't know how they thought that was going to protect us, but that's what we did. For me, my first memory of a global event was when I was very young. We were living in Ohio. My father was flying B-52s. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was probably first or second grade. That'll give you a hint as to how old I am. But what I remember very clearly is my dad coming home in his flight suit, getting this huge, big duffel bag filled with all of his gear. And his demeanor was very serious. It wasn't casual. And I remember him talking to my mom. I remember him telling her, keep the television on, watch the TV, you'll figure out what's going on. And depending on what happens, get on a train and go to Albuquerque and go stay with your mom. And it wasn't until years later that we were told that when that occurred, he really thought when he said goodbye to us that he would never see us again. That we were that close to nuclear war with the Russians. But that's what I remember, that the tenor of his discussion with my mom was very different. The house was tense. I had no clue what was really going on. I just knew it was different. I think a lot of us may remember Kennedy's, but for me, the next big event was my experience during the Vietnam War. My father was stationed at Riverside at March Air Force Base. We got there. Within 2 weeks, he was deployed TDY for 179 days. He'd come home for 2 weeks. He'd go out for 179, come back. This went on for 2.5 years. And he flew missions out of Guam, Andersen Air Force Base, and Utapao in Thailand. the interesting thing I remember is I knew my dad was, involved in this war. I knew it was dangerous. But imagine yourself as a sixth grader in Southern California wearing bell bottoms and you've got hippies around you and everything is cool and you want to be cool. And even though I know this was a very harsh event, I think my mind was somewhere else, was probably more on how to be cool and boys. And it wasn't until much later that I really understood just how serious things were. I do remember the race riots when we were in California and everything that was going on nationally. And I really wanted to be a hippie, but I was too young and my mother just wouldn't give me the freedom to go off and, I don't know, do whatever hippies do. What was interesting though, is I do remember very clearly living in California of this make love, not war, and the juxtaposition between what my father did and what people were doing in Southern California. That was really quite a concept for me. So what was our daily life like?
So our daily life here, I actually picked some things that military brats in general share, because we all either have to deal with it or it's part of our lives. We'll start with go down the list here. You can go into pretty much any military family house and you are gonna find rations or MREs in their homes because our parents always made sure they had rations available because you never know what was gonna happen. To this day, my father still has them in his pantry. The alphabets, you're learning your alphabets as well as learning the phonetic alphabet because there's so many acronyms in the military, so you have to learn them. Your ID, you're not only learning your school ID when you're growing up, but you also have to learn your military one because you need to know your sponsors' last four of their social. Anywhere you go, that's what they're going to ask for. So you always had to make sure that you learn that. Most of the churches on a military base have American flags flown in the churches. Civilian life, you're not going to see that. Military, you always see a American flag hanging. Everybody's called by their last names. I grew up being called Duran because that's what my name was. I don't even have a middle initial. It was Alexis, no middle initial Duran. Always went by Duran. My dad's the same way. Let's see what colors. In the evenings at 5 o'clock, you have to stop because they're going to raise the flag and you got to show your respect. Everybody still does that on most military and all military bases. Let's see what else. You're gonna find that most military brats have some kind of perfectionist trait. Some more than others, but most of us are try to do that perfectionist because that's how we were raised in the military. Everything needed to be perfect. Whether it's our appearance or the way we do our work, your work ethic, we try to be as perfection as possible. If you are not 15 minutes early, you are late. If you are on time, you are 15 minutes late. That is how I grew up. I still live by that. It's the way it is. I know a lot of our military brats kind of live the same way. Holidays, and me and Roxanne talked about this. I spent many holidays not here in New Mexico with our family, but on base in a military chow hall eating the most amazing food that they would make for us. We had many holidays in the chow hall, but great food, always great food. Chores, most military brats come from a family of chores. To this day, I still have perfect bed making skills because we weren't allowed to leave our house in the morning until that bed was made. What's the next one? Uniform. We all have respect for people in uniform, men, women. If you see people who have their military hats on showing that they were part of the military, we will go show our respect for them. We're very respectful. The last thing on my list is the go bag. And the go bag, especially for us who lived in the overseas, we had to have a go bag ready at all times because if something went wrong where we were living, you had to be able to grab your go bag and get out of that country within X amount of hours. So we always had extra clothes, we had our passports, our military IDs, we had snacks just in case because sometimes you're not going to get food right away. We always had our to-go bag ready, and even as an adult, if I leave town, I have some kind of go bag with me to make sure we have everything we need.
Alexis and I were saying, and when you have kids, you have to make sure that the food is, the baby is the expiration date for the formula and stuff. But that concept for both of us seemed to kick in real quickly when we had the fires a couple of years ago. I thought, okay, I'm gonna have my car ready. I had my car ready to go. It was my go car, ready to go in case we got evacuated. So our lists are actually pretty similar. I'm just going to point out a couple of different things. So she had her meals in the chow hall. My father's work cycle was really remarkably different because he was in B-52s. Again, this is during the Cold War, and we had planes 24/7. I forget what the term is, but they were on alert. We had planes flying around the globe 24/7, B-52s and other aircraft. And so every other week, the B-52 crews and the tanker crews would go pull what they called alert. And they lived in these underground bunkers. This goes underground, and they lived underground. And then on the week they weren't on alert, they'd be flying long missions to keep their flying skills up. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. That's one of my big memories, and one of my fond memories is eating underground for the holidays. And then on the summers, we had picnics outside. I think for me, one of the things is friends come and go. Sometimes some of us that grew up in the military might seem aloof. We don't get too close to people. It's not because we don't want to, it's because you get used to knowing that people come and go in your life. But in our house, my dad always thought he was in charge, but really it was my mom. And what I always loved is she'd threaten us with, wait until your dad gets home. And we'd go, you're more frightening, Mom, than Daddy is. Where I grew up, there was constant air traffic. I love the notion and sound of airplanes. It's just a comfort to me. I was down at Holloman last week, and there were jets flying, and it just brought a sense of calm to me. The one thing that I do remember is when you would get to a new base, or you'd start with some new people, the one question, Alexis, I'd be interested to know if you got this too. What does your dad do? Right? And then you compare, where do you live? What does your dad do? And that kind of, I don't know what it did, but that was one of the questions a lot of kids would always ask each other.
My dad was a mechanic.
Yeah, and mine was a pilot. I couldn't wait till I got to 10 so I could get my ID card. That was a rite of passage for BRATS, is to get that military ID card. My dad was deployed a lot, PCS, but I will say the one thing that I thought was really fun growing up is once a year they'd open up the flight line, and the BRATS could go crawl through B-52s. We literally would get from one end and we could crawl through them and play it. You know, we didn't get to touch the buttons, but I got to eat underground in this alert facility. We'd get to the flight line. And one thing that sticks with me today is because these guys would be on alert, we would meet my dad and for church, or we'd go to the theater together, but we always had to sit in the back row because if the klaxon went off, they would have to rush out and get to their airplanes. So even today, I sit at the back. And if you want to see a really good film that kind of just, it's a good sort of training film for a lot of things, Dr. Strangelove will give you a good sense of what this is. So if you're ever wondering how many schools BRATS go to, we just put this up there. Alexis, how many did you end up going to?
8 schools.
8 different schools. Mid-year too, I bet a lot of these.
Yeah, some of them were.
And I have, I think mine came to 10, 4 high schools. So depending on where they're at, you could be missing 4th grade, or you could be, I remember we went from Ohio to California. I missed adding and subtracting fractions. I still can't do it today. So there are some disadvantages. So that's what we wanted to share with you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we were happy to answer questions, have dialogue. I'd be interested if any of you that are watching today are military brats, and share your stories with us. Or if you have questions for us, that's good too.
Thank you both. I hope there are several questions out there. I think this was fascinating. I didn't grow up in a military family, so you've taught me a lot. And I can just imagine what that must have been like. So thank you for painting a vivid picture.
You know, and one of the things Alexis and I have been talking about is sort of I'm a generation before her. And the kids that we have today that are military brats, I would say starting from Iraq and Afghanistan, those kids didn't have just one parent deploy. They had sometimes both parents deploying. And so imagine that you are left with your grandparents, your aunt or your uncle for a year. And you're being essentially raised by somebody else for that year and leaving your child behind. My daughter-in-law was Army, and and I'm very proud of the fact that she served. She had to leave her daughter while she served. She was a single parent, and she had to go to Afghanistan, and she was at another location for another deployment. That's a hard thing to even imagine. So there isn't a lot of research on brats to begin with. And I think what's happened with the kids today, with the ones that are really, again, from Afghanistan and Iraq going forward, that'd be a really interesting group to study what their experience is, especially if both parents got deployed at the same time. And it did happen quite a bit. Alexis, do you know any folks that happened to?
I do know a few. We do have friends that the grandparents landed up with the children because both parents were sent to Iraq during the same time, and the child was with the grandparent for almost a year and a half. And you know, there's some disconnection there when the child isn't with the parents, so it's difficult.
I will share a story as a spouse. My husband got a commission. He was gone for several months when our second child was only 2 months old when he took off. When he came back to join the family in New York, my son was already a year old, and he missed, you know, but that's the other thing. Military families miss a lot of significant events: birthdays, weddings, deaths, Christmas, anniversaries. So when my husband came home, he's excited to see us all. My son saw him and ran the other way crying because he didn't know who that man was, you know. And of course, my husband's heart kind of went, but bottom line is, this happens. You miss. So we have a question here. Joe, thanks for enjoying our stories. We could go on. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks. And how do you make it miss fourth grades? I'd like to research on this. Well, there's a story behind that question. The bottom line is, I don't know that people do miss fourth grades, but you do miss things in school. You do miss things. And again, I miss the fractions. I can't do it today.
My sister missed second grade. She had to redo it because she missed so much of second grade. She had to redo it.
Well, there you go. So maybe that person who missed fourth grade needs to go back and do fourth grade again.
Yeah.
This one says, I do remember Mom had the TV on during Vietnam. He'd go away on a mission and come back, and I thought he'd die and he'd come back and go again. And so I'll disclosure here. That's my middle sister. She was about, I don't know, how old were you? 3 or 4? So different perspectives of age really come into play of how we experience these events globally. DODS is actually Department of Defense dependent schools. And actually Kirtland has their own schools. I believe Holloman has some of their own schools. Different places, but overseas for sure, they have their own school systems, and they are really quite advanced. They have I remember when I worked at DODS, I was a teacher's aide when we were living in England. They had a kindergarten position open, and they had over 3,000 applications for one teaching position. They typically get people who are highly qualified, lots of years. But the one thing that makes them a little different is they actually train the teachers on how to work with military kids. If you have a husband who's going to get deployed, I'll give you a quick story. My husband was getting deployed for a year to Turkey. We weren't allowed to go with him. And so when my husband was deployed or TDY a lot, our youngest son would act out, and a lot of kids do. They misbehave. And so I let the principal know that his dad was going to be gone and to be aware of it. Well, in a civilian school, they don't really understand what that means. In a DOD school, the parent could go in and say, so-and-so is deploying, and the teachers have a totally different perspective on how to work with those kids. You probably experienced it more as a student. Maybe you could address that a little more.
I did experience as a student because I was one of those kids that about got sent home. So don't fight when you're in DOD schools because they will send you home. It's a fear because as a kid in those schools, if you get in trouble, you're risking that your father's first sergeant, whoever is their commander, is going to be called. And if they get called, you can be sent home because you're not acting right or whatever the situation is. And amen that we had, for the most part, we had really good administration and good teachers that knew how to deal with us and all of the craziness that came with us.
But they do, and I will say, you made a comment earlier, Alexis, that they were advanced. Academically, those kids are stellar.
Yes.
They tend to outperform nationally on SATs and ACTs. They tend to get a lot of scholarships when they graduate from high school. And part of it's because they're driven, but I think a lot of it has to do with the school. Their curriculum is pretty rigid.
Yeah. I can tell you that what I was learning in school, in the middle school in Germany, as 8th grader, they were teaching that stuff at seniors here in Las Vegas. Like 4 years difference, and I was learning what seniors were learning here in Las Vegas as an 8th grader. Because when we moved back here, I was so bored because we were so advanced in the DOT school systems.
They really are a model of how to work with diverse populations with different learning abilities, learning styles. And that's the other thing I will say too. We didn't talk about it, but when you go overseas, you still have all the same abilities for ADA compliance and what have you. But when you do go overseas, they do screen your family members to determine whether or not there's a condition within the family, maybe a medical condition that cannot be met at the location to which you're going to be stationed at. And so if you have a medical condition and they don't have anything, let's say you're going to Ramstein in Germany, and they don't have that ability to take care of that health condition, they won't send that member and their family overseas. It's a very structured environment in many ways. I'd love to hear some more questions or experiences from others. I know some of you are brats. I didn't share, but there are some at the end of the slides. I'll put that up real quick so you can see there are some resources. This first one was done predominantly on people from World War II and the Korean War. There's been a couple of follow-ups. There's a couple of sites here, but not enough has been done. And one of the things that Alexis and I were talking about earlier was that it probably wasn't until the Gulf War that military leadership really began to understand that they need to take care of family members at the same time they take care of the active duty members, so that the active duty member who's being deployed does not have to worry about the well-being of their family members left behind. Kind of a new concept.
It's a very new concept. When my dad was in the military, we had one of his first sergeants tell us if the Army wanted them to have a family, they would have issued you a family. They didn't really, especially the Army, and I think the Air Force was a little bit more caring with the family, but I think they didn't start really giving a lot of consideration to families. It was probably when my dad was in the Middle East that they were starting to try to make sure that the families were fully taken care of. And not just physically with homes, but also making sure that their mental health was in check as well.
Yeah, full services.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? I'd love to answer some.
So I just wanted to say here at the end, everybody asked what BRATS stands for, and Nowadays, it mainly stands for born resilient and tough. So that's what the military brat stands for.
You need to stand up so people can see your t-shirt. She has the military brat t-shirt.
The
There are-
dandelion is the logo of the military brat because no matter where we are, we're resilient, we grow, we adapt to wherever we're at like a dandelion does.
So I'll put that back up so people can see it real quick. There is a month of April is devoted in the military sectors to the military brats. And the big celebration day is April 30th. The color for military brats is purple. So you will see that in April, if you're around a military base, you'll see a lot of purple, you'll see a lot of dandelions. But it is sort of a separate sector subculture, if you will, that's pretty cool. Here's a question. Do you feel connected with other military brats when you meet them? I've discovered it really does help. Absolutely. That's how we ended up doing this session. We started talking, we found out we were brats. And even though I'm sort of a generation above, older, the stories are similar. The experiences are similar. And so you get that connectivity. I guess part of it is like when we meet an alum from Highlands, we know what their experience has been. We know what the institution's like. We know what the kind of environment that they came to school here. So when you make that connection with somebody, it's like a veteran meeting a veteran. If you've ever seen two veterans talking, God help you, they won't stop. They just keep going and going and going. But it's the same thing. I mean, we've had a good time just kind of putting this together, sharing stories and the similarities, Army and Air Force, the similarities for those kids is very, very similar. The experience is both positive. We didn't talk about the negatives today because we wanted to keep this positive, but there are a lot of negatives that go along with this too. And some of them are remarkably personal to each individual of what they experience.
I can honestly say we can go anywhere, and if you meet military brats, they're gonna take care of each other.
Yeah.
Whether you guys been best friends forever or you just met, a military brat will take care of a military brat.
I had just a question. That connection sounds wonderful that you have. If a family was living overseas, and it might be different now than it was when you were all younger, but if there was like a condition or a problem with a member of the family that couldn't be taken care of on the base or in that community, would the family have to be sent back to the US? And then what would happen to the service member who was